Hello and welcome to the Wire special discussion today on rising fuel prices. Since the May 14th, for the last 10 days, there have been consecutive hikes of petrol and diesel, and today's hike was the largest. Petrol was hiked by 32 paise and diesel was hiked by 28 paise. Today, over the last 10 days, petrol prices and diesel prices have roughly gone up by 2.5 rupees. And today in Delhi, it crossed the 77 rupee mark. In Mumbai, petrol is now selling for close to 85 rupees, and in Chennai, it's at 80 rupees. Diesel, we see similar prices, 68 in Delhi and above 70 and 72 in Mumbai and Calcutta. My name is Anuj Srivas. I'm joined today by Venu, the founding editor of The Wire. Venu, I mean, the last time we saw, fuel prices, the threat of rising fuel prices, and people worrying about it was back in 2012, 13, 14, during the UPA.
2013, yeah.
Correct. During the UPA 2 administration. For our viewers and readers of The Wire who are not aware, there are a lot of factors that affect the price of diesel and petrol in India, but the single most important factor is international crude, Brent crude. The Modi government's defense over the last few weeks with regard to this price rise is that Brent crude, the price of international oil is going up. And these are for a lot of international factors, sanctions on Iran, Venezuela's output has reduced, so we can't do anything. We have deregulated diesel and petrol. These are market prices, and unfortunately, I mean, that's their primary defense as of right now. Are they correct?
See, Anuj, I'll tell you where they are not correct and they are being hypocritical, which is, if you remember, when they came to power in 2014, the international crude prices dramatically dropped from some $115 per barrel to down to 40. Now, they had a huge upside, and they indeed celebrated that upside. They said and they also said they are not going to reduce taxes because they will use that huge upside to fund infrastructure. And they said that their primary policy was to drive infrastructure-driven growth, GDP growth. Now, if you see the last, say, 3 years, because they didn't reduce taxes, they've collected twice as much from oil tax revenues as opposed to the years before 2014. I'll just give you a rough idea. Before 2014, the average oil tax revenues, both center and state, used to be 2.5 lakh crore. Post 2014, it has been 4.5 lakh crores per year average. So you can imagine the huge upside that they've got.
Correct. Yeah.
Having got that, I find that when I see the budget papers, the capital expenditure growth. Now, if they're saying that they're spending on infrastructure, it should show up in the capital expenditure growth. Capital expenditure has only grown average 7% of the last 3 years. Barely 2% above inflation. So I'm wondering, where has all the money gone? Only this government knows. And number two, now that the oil prices are back up to $80 and you've lost that huge upside that you had earlier, and they collected the money, now it only stands to reason that they give it back to the people and not keep passing on the burden from here on as international prices go up. If it goes up to, say, further $5, it doesn't mean that already since independence we have had the highest rates for petrol, 80 rupees plus in all the metros, average, right? So my question is, where is the justification for levying 100% tax on the landed cost of fuel in this country? Because
Sure. For our readers and viewers who are not aware about this, so taxes on petrol, we have a graphic for you people to take a look at. So essentially, in 1 liter of petrol, there are certain amountage the dealer has to pay to the oil marketing companies to get, and then what adds on to it are a central tax and a state tax. Correct, right? So since 2014, they have raised central taxes.
Yeah.
Correct. I mean, I think the last figure that we saw was since from June 2014 to 2016, excise duty on petrol.
Right.
And
so what was happening was when the international prices crashed, they kept raising the taxes and therefore ensured that the price to the consumer did not drop.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So so we have in our graphic in September 2013, the price of petrol in Delhi was 76.1, and in May 2018, that's the same price right now. Same day, 21st on Monday, it was also 76.1. But because international crude oil prices were much higher at that point, the dealer would pay around 50 rupees.
Yeah.
And central taxes at that point was around 10 rupees and state taxes around 12 rupees. But now you compare that same figure to now, central taxes have shot up to 19 rupees, state taxes have shot up to 16 rupees. This is an increase of 105%.
So basically, so there's a 100% increase in taxes.
Correct.
And therefore a 100% increase in the price
Correct.
that the consumer is paying over and above the cost of. So another point, Anuj, our petroleum minister, this government has been saying, constantly has been repeating that oil sector should be brought into the GST network.
Correct.
If it is brought to the GST network, even if you place it the highest GST slab, which is 28%, oil prices should immediately drop to at least 50 rupees or less.
Correct.
Petrol and diesel, rather than 80 rupees now.
Correct.
Imagine what difference it will make. But they do not want to do it. They say that, how can we forego revenues? And this is the same government which has been claiming for the last 2 years, we're all witness to it, that post-demonetization, the anti-black money drive has resulted in massive increase in taxpayers coming to the official net. Now, that's where you have to, widen your tax net and increase your tax collection, which is direct taxes.
Correct.
If you're doing that, why don't you give people relief on indirect taxes? The basic principle in economics on indirect taxes, because you levy the same tax on everybody, rich and poor, therefore the tax rate has to be very low. You can't have 100% tax on diesel, which a poor farmer is consuming, or a poor Uber driver for whom diesel is an input into his pricing.
Yeah.
Why are you making the people of this country suffer with a 100% tax on the cost of petrol?
Yeah.
That's my basic question.
Correct. But Venu, so the counter argument was that, from 2014, just a few months after the Modi government came to power, international crude oil prices crashed from 100 plus to 40. And some would argue that from 2014 to 2016, when crude oil prices were still low, it was smart economics to sort of hike up, because when the UPA 2 left, the fiscal situation was not that good. Our current account deficit was bad, fiscal deficit was bad. Was it not smart economics for them to sort of maintain that advantage as long as crude oil prices were low?
No, I'll tell you why it was not smart economics. I feel smarter economics would have been to have given part of the fall in oil prices, passed it on to the consumer, so that consumer demand would have gone up. So what have we seen? The government's claim was that it is using up the fall in crude prices. They did not pass it on to the consumer, kept raising taxes, kept collecting a huge amount of tax revenues, nearly 4.5 lakh crores a year.
2 lakh crore increase.
Yeah, 2 lakh crore increase a year. Yeah. So in three years, they've got extra 6 lakh crores compared to prior to 2014. Now, if they claim, if you have to go by their claim that is spent on infrastructure, then I'm not seeing that leading to GDP growth, because GDP growth has been declining. So in retrospect, I feel that if they had passed on at least a good 20, 30, 40% of that to the consumer and kept about 40, 50% for infrastructure, it might have been a more balanced policy. This tax and spend policy doesn't seem to have worked. High tax and spend, government spend policy. Then if you had passed on to the consumer, it might have worked better.
Correct, that's true. But no one was, I think, no one was complaining until 2016. So what happened was from 2016 to 2018, we've started to see international crude oil prices increase again. Yeah. So from 46, in the mid of 2016, last week it breached the, psychologically $80 mark. Yeah. And
this is the highest since independence, I'm told.
Correct.
People are not complaining as long as it was in the early 60s,
Correct.
So the government was collecting its taxes. Okay, the consumer felt that he was not getting the benefit of fall in the oil price, but at the same time, if consumer felt he was not being excessively being taxed. But now I think all limits have been crossed.
Right. So what is, another argument that the oil minister Dharmendra Pradhan put forth yesterday, and the BJP has also taken this line, is that you can't just blame the central government. State government also, they levy
back. But BJP is running all the most of the state governments. They are here, they are there.
Correct.
So now BJP has nothing to say because it's everywhere, you know.
Yeah.
So and all the big states are being run by BJP.
Correct.
Now the thing, yesterday Amit Shah came on television and said within 2 or 3 days we are coming up with a solution.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what the solution will be. The only solution that I can see is reducing taxes. They have to give the consumer at least a relief of at least 10 rupees to 12 rupees. From it's gone up beyond 80 rupees petrol, diesel about 75. I think we have to come to below 70 rupees.
Can this be done in a one go, or do you think this has to be staggered out?
They have to. They're caught in a bit of a trap, right?
Correct.
And this was inevitable.
Yeah.
You know, when the international prices fell, they were celebrating, and Narendra Modi said it was his great luck that that the prices had fallen and Indian economy was getting a huge upside. And now, as we go into 2019 elections, I think the same Narendra Modi seems to be sort of run out of luck.
Yeah.
And he has to do something now. And one way is probably that the government will postpone it may increase its borrowing. One way of doing it is that you relax your fiscal deficit by 0.5%. No harm in that, right?
Sure.
So far they had been they've been so fussy about letting the fisc, relax or loosening the fisc a bit. So by all means, loosen the fisc a little and pass it on to the consumer.
Correct.
And the other solution which governments have adopted in the past is you don't pay the oil companies, and you kind of you give IOUs to oil companies.
Yeah.
So,
or as the Wire we reported yesterday that ONGC and Oil India might be asked to step up and share the subsidy burden.
So that will create the subsidy actually moves out of the government's books and it actually goes into the books of the oil companies, and poor oil companies will borrow money from the market to meet the obligations of the government.
Yeah.
Now, well, if you do that, it's bad economics, Your oil companies also have shareholders, so they will complain. The minority shareholders of Indian Oil Company or ONGC, or HPCL, now who is to take care of their interests?
Correct. Right. But bringing it under GST, so that's another thing that you mentioned earlier. So this discretion in excise duties can largely go away if you bring it under a higher rate.
Yeah.
But
in fact, if it is brought under GST, what is to stop this government, which is controlling bulk of the state governments? They control the GST council. Why don't you just sit together and say, okay, let's begin the process of bringing oil sector to GST. Imagine, oil is 40% of all indirect tax revenues comes from oil, and you kept 40% of economic activity outside GST, which you are touting as the biggest reform since independence, which is only 60%. Some might call it half baked, right? If you're keeping 40% of the economic activity out, so let them bring it. I would suggest that they bring it into in GST oil sector. And if not immediately bring it down to 28, the peak, they can make a beginning. They can start gradually, maybe say from 50%, maybe come down to 40, then to 28.
Correct. Yeah.
So
another thing that we want to address, and this is stuff that we've also written stories on, is the myth of market pricing. So what we saw. And we've seen this in the past. This is not new to this government, but in the run-up to the Karnataka state election, Indian oil companies, IOC, HPCL, they froze their hikes, even though this was international.
They run-up to Bihar elections also. Yeah.
Correct, right. But the IOC chairman today, he came out and said, no, we have completely independent pricing, and we were waiting to see if international oil prices would stabilize. But deregulation shows that it simply hasn't worked out, right? If they had been able to stagger the hike over the course of the last 3-4 months.
Yeah, I guess it is there on paper.
Yeah.
But we all know public sector companies are run by the government, and the government sometimes uses its discretion, its whims and fancies to calibrate depending on when elections are due. Now we have 2 more elections due, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh. I'm sure a few weeks before that they'll stop increasing oil prices, or they'll reduce it and pass it on to the oil companies. And mind you, these oil companies, it's very unfortunate that these oil companies had kind of recovered, their balance sheets were looking good, their share price were doing well. over the last 2-3 years when the international prices came down and market determined pricing was being followed in letter and in spirit. But now, if politically, if this government doesn't have political will to cut taxes and take the burden on itself and not pass it on to the oil company, then the oil companies will go back to their earlier condition where the balance sheet will start bleeding. It will be most unfortunate.
That's true. Right. Okay. On that note, I think we'll wrap up today's discussion. Venu says that hopefully in the coming months we will see up to a 10 rupee cut in the prices of petrol. And
they'll have to do it, otherwise they'll lose elections.
Correct, that's true. But stay tuned for more of our coverage on the same issue. Thanks.